Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. This is Roots, Reefs, and Reactions. I'm Kyle. If you're new here, welcome. If you're returning, thank you for supporting the channel so far. In today's video, I'm going to go over a brief Walstad method approach and what I think, in my experience so far, are the best plants, fish, and invertebrates to put into your system. While the Walstad method can be deployed through many different tanks and setups and aquascapes, there's kind of three main pieces that I just mentioned that goes along with these: the fish, the invertebrates, and the plants. And these three moving pieces really kind of help you tune your system and make sure that you have a balance between one another, where you have the fish are the main focal point of the tank, you have the invertebrates that help kind of clean up the tank, and then you have the plants that actually absorb the nutrients and the toxic materials that come out of those and help keep the tank running. Keeping a well-maintained and balanced system is key for having the longevity of the tank. If some of these parts are out of order or aren't in sync correctly, then you'll have a lot of intervention with the tank. And this tank, of course, is the approach you want to take for an easy, hands-off, low-tech aquarium. I'll first start with the best fish for Walstad method style tanks. I will say that a lot of these choices come down to my experience with nano or pico tanks. I feel like these are really nice for little desktop aquariums, kind of like the one that I have behind me. And these are what I prefer, and a lot of these are going to be skewed towards having those style of tank. Of course, you can have larger Walstad method tanks, but I don't have a lot of experience with these. And I think these main messages that I'm going to go through apply to those larger tanks. You're just allowed to increase this more than you would for a nano or pico Walstad method tank. There's kind of three criteria that I look for when choosing a fish for a Walstad method tank. The first being small with a low bio load. This helps maintain the tank so you don't have a lot of ammonia and nitrate and nitrite coming from the fish because the amount that it requires to eat. I also feel that smaller fish kind of give the scape a larger dynamic. So a smaller fish in a smaller tank or even a larger tank really gives it a greater feel and kind of a aura of size difference that really makes for an interesting tank. The second, of course, is a fish species that won't mess with the substrate, the plants, or the other animals in there, such as invertebrates. You don't want to introduce a species that will start to tear up plants, that will start to sift through the substrate, releasing that soil that you have underneath your gravel cap. And you don't want anything messing with the shrimp so that you have adverse interactions between these and they can live harmoniously. And then lastly is picking a fish that could live inside the system. So if you want a system that's really overgrown, has a lot of nooks and crannies, has a lot of over coverage, you want a fish that likes that type of style. If you want a tank that's a little more open, a little more aquascaped, like you see in some of the aquascaping shows with low-lying plants, then you want a fish that is okay with having that more open style of tank. So with those three things in mind, here's a couple of fish that will probably do pretty well in Walstad method tanks, and specifically in nano aquariums. The first most obvious choice is a betta fish. These betta fish are okay in smaller aquariums. They are relatively available in any big box store, and there's a lot of designer betta fish that you can actually get that kind of suit the aesthetic of the tank. They're also great because they can thrive in a solo environment, and you actually prefer to keep them in solo environments. And they won't really have any adverse effects with snails or shrimp they have inside the tank. Betta fish are okay in a range of tank styles, like I talked about, more open layout or more cavernous type of layouts. So you can really tune your aquarium and have the understanding that the betta fish will be okay in those type of systems. But if you want more fish in a smaller style tank that are more schooling type fish, then another choice would be tetras, such as neon tetras. These are really small, schooling, and peaceful fish that can easily thrive with other shrimp and invertebrates in the system. They won't mess with any of the plants. They're great at schooling, so they will have a lot of personality when you walk across the tank, and they're very easy to maintain. They're also great because they're great scavengers. As they school with each other, they'll go throughout the tank and look for any leftover food. And there's a wide variety of colors and styles for tetras. There's neon tetras, there's ember tetras, there's more natural looking tetras, and these again are pretty available in your local big box store or even local fish store. These are hardy fish as well, so they'll thrive in a wide variety of tanks. Another great option for schooling type fish that are different than tetras are rasboras. These are elegant looking fish. They have a wide variety of different colorways. And I believe closely related are Danios. These are pretty similar fish that are great at schooling. They're extremely peaceful, and they're just great interactions when you walk by the tank. And then if you're looking for more bottom dwelling fish that have a little bit more scavenging in their system, and a great choice, which I have personally, is pygmy corridoras. These are great little schooling fish. Sometimes they're together, sometimes they're opposite side of the tank. They stay extremely small and they look really natural inside of a planted Walstad method tank. But if you do get a little bit bigger tank, maybe slightly larger than a nano, then you can go towards loaches. There's some really amazing looking loaches out there that add a lot of interesting style to your Walstad method tank. And again, these are pretty hardy fish. They may be a little bit harder to find, but your local fish store should be able to get some for you. And again, remember, these are just some of my top picks. If you look for Walstad method fish online, you'll find a whole plethora of information. And if you have a larger tank, you'll be able to fit a lot more fish in there and a lot of different species of fish in there as well. Any planted style tank and the fish that thrive in those are likely to thrive in Walstad method tanks. The only difference is maybe you'll have less flow inside of a Walstad method tank, and you might want just a little bit hardier of a fish, just in case you do run into any issues with nutrients, excess nutrients, and filtration issues. And then next up, I'll talk about some of my favorite plants for Walstad method tanks. Walstad method tanks require a mix of fast growing and slow growing plants in there, so you can absorb a lot of those quickly release nutrients from the soil bed in the fast growing plants, and then you can establish a lot of the root systems inside of the soil and gravel through the slower growing plants. And just like with planted tanks in aquascapes that you see online, it's always good to have a mixture of different styles and textures inside of the tank. So having some taller plants, having some mid-ground and foreground plants really adds to the scapes. And I'd say it's even more important to have floating plants inside of Walstad method tanks, because they're great nutrient absorbers from the water column, while the other plants are growing into the soil, and the roots typically only absorb nutrients from the soil bed. So having those floating plants to help clean and neutralize the water column is extremely beneficial in Walstad method tanks. But just some plant ideas for those plants that are in the soil in the tank. You have hornwort, which is an extremely fast growing plant. It's bushy, it adds a lot of great texture to the more background plants. Likewise, you can use pearlweed, which has less bushy and more sustained leaves on the plants. And you can also use Pogoscenum erectus, which adds a little bit more needle-shaped plants. And these are all plants that I use inside of my tank and would highly recommend. For slightly smaller plants in front of those, you could go for Java ferns or Anubias, which add a lot of texture in their larger foliage and don't grow typically as tall as those aforementioned plants. Cryptocoryns are also another great species, and they have lots of different colors and sizes that you can get. And a lot of these plants are great too. The more mid-ground plants are great because you can attach them directly to rots, and their roots will grow outside of the soil and give a lot of awesome texture and detail inside of your tank. And then lastly, for those plants that are in the soil, then you want more of your foreground plants that are typically smaller, don't have as much height to them. And then the very front, you want just a little bit smaller plants, maybe some carpeting plants that just add the extra bit of detail to your tank. In my tank personally, I use dwarf Sagittaria. This is a hardy grass looking plant that sends runners, and it can quickly carpet, and you can easily trim it down to give it more of a carpet look once it starts to fill in over a couple of months. I know people have also had success with dwarf hairgrass, which is the smaller cousin of the Sagittarius I just talked about. This is a lot smaller, a lot more grass looking. It can stay really low to the gravel surface, and it can carpet and give a really great aquascape texture. And then just a couple honorable mentions for those plants that are rooted in the soil. I would say anything fast growing is typically a really good choice for a Walstad method tank, such as Rotala, baby tears, and Embulia. But besides those that are rooted into the soil, like I talked about, you want something that is floating on the surface. I would say my favorite are red root floaters and water lettuce. These are great because they stay large. They have really great root systems that come out of them. Basically, any of these floating plants will do fine in Walstad method tanks. The only one I recommend staying away from is duckweed, because it grows so rapidly, it can get sucked into your systems and it becomes more of a pain Although some tanks, it does look great, especially when you have the little rings that you can feed the fish through. It looks really nice. But as soon as you have that covering your tank, it's gonna be an issue to take it out constantly because the plants under the water will not get enough light because they are blocking them out on the surface. So I would avoid any floating plant that reproduces too quickly or is too small to easily remove. But again, it's your choice. You can't really go wrong with any of these. I just highly recommend that you use floating plants in Walstad method tanks. And then lastly on this list are your cleanup crew or your invertebrates in your tank, such as shrimp and snails. I'll first start with shrimp because they're a little bit more interesting. The snails is a smaller list, but I will give a couple hints on what I have seen in my past. Again, just like for the fish, you want the shrimp to be peaceful and low maintenance. And of course you want species that will actually help maintain the tank. So you don't want any designer species that don't really do much and kind of sit around. You want stuff that actually will help break down the detritus inside of the tank. The number one go-to for these type of tanks is any algae eating shrimp. Any of these type of shrimp are great for these tanks. And I think it's really up to you on your decision what your tank looks like and what kind of pop of color you want. I personally wanted to keep it more natural looking, so I just went with the classic algae eating shrimp. So they're essentially colorless. Some of them have a little bit of brown to them, but it looks a lot more natural than adding a pop of blue or red to the tank. They will reproduce, but they're pretty good with reproducing up to a place in which they're comfortable as a community. So you won't have tanks typically overrun by shrimp. They'll only reproduce when they know that they're able to maintain that community. And then the only other really shrimp that a lot of you will run into in your local fish stores is probably bamboo shrimp. I have seen people keep these successfully inside of Walstad method tanks and of course in planted aquariums. It might require a little bit more work and they are larger, so I wouldn't suggest these in nano tanks per se, but they are a super interesting species, especially if you do have a larger Walstad method tank. And then lastly are snails. There's a plethora of snails that you can get for Walstad method tanks or really any planted aquarium. And partly it's up to you to decide what you want, but there are some downsides and upsides to each of the snail species. One of the most popular are nayrite snails, and they come a lot of interesting colors and have really cool shells. I will say that I've had them in the past, and the only issue that I've run into them is laying eggs. It's not that they reproduce, but if you only have a couple in there and they're possibly not mating, they'll just lay eggs, and these eggs will be stuck onto rocks, onto plants, onto the sides of the tank, and onto the wood that you have in the tank, and it's rather unsightly. So I'll look at pictures. If you're okay with this, then they're great snails to add to your system. But if you don't want to run into this issue, then I'll move on to some of the other snails. Another great choice is ram's horn snails. They are effective algae eaters and they're really good at keeping your tank clean. They can reproduce quickly, but again, they usually self-regulate, so it's not an issue that a lot of people run it into. And then I personally have bladder snails. I didn't intentionally add them. I bought a bunch of plants and just kind of assumed that there would be some amount of snails on them because they are from community tanks, and a couple of them did come along. They reproduce rapidly. I started out with probably 2 that I found in my tank in maybe the first couple of weeks after adding the plants, and now I have a lot. You can see babies all over the place, but again, it's not uncontrolled, and they do a lot of good to your tank. And again, they add a little bit of ambiance to your tank and a little bit of size, and they're really interesting to watch as well, just how they move around and how they suck the algae off the glass. And then the last snail that I'll put into your consideration, if you kind of want to go the route with the more colorful shrimp, if you want to follow along with that with your snails, you can go towards mystery snails. These snails, again, are similar to bladder snails and are really effective at cleaning the tank and keeping it detritus free. But one consideration for mystery snails are because they are a little bit larger than bladder snails and some of the other snails that you can find for Walstad method tanks. They do have a higher bioload, so typically you want these in a larger tank, maybe 10 plus gallons, especially if they start to reproduce. You don't want too much bioload in your tank if your nitrifying bacteria can't handle that. And I just want to come back to the beginning of the video where I talk about creating a balanced community, where it's really important to have a cleanup crew, your shrimp and snails that help keep it algae and detritus free, along with fish that add that special connection that you have with the tank and that they won't interact adversely with the snails or shrimp. It's also really important in the tank, in Walstad method tank specifically, that you have a smaller community of these animals, so only a couple fish, a couple shrimp, and then snails, so that your bioload is low enough that you don't run into excess nutrients inside your tank, and that the nitrifying bacteria can produce the harmless nitrates in the tank, and then that can be recycled by the plants in the tank. Having too high of a bioload will then cause issues such as algae or death of plants or animals. So you really want to be careful with adding animals slowly and having enough cleanup crew to kind of work through this nitrogen cycle along with the bacteria in the tank. I will soon be posting a video on going through a setup of a Walstad method tank, including getting all the materials, setting up the tank, showing how to plant, how the addition of animals and cleanup crew works inside the tanks, and what you can expect going through this cycle, and the patience that's sometimes required in setting up these style of tanks. But with Walstad method tanks, you can make beautiful aquascapes that mimic nature a little bit better, I think, than some of the stuff that you see on Instagram, and they're extremely low maintenance. But if you want to hear how I set up my tank and how it has been successful so far, I will link a video at the end of this so you can check that out and see how this is a very successful, very easy and straightforward method to creating beautiful tanks. If you have any questions or want me to dive deeper into any of these topics, please leave a comment down below. I'll hit you back and I'll try to make a video on anything that seems pretty important. I'm still running through this and I'm happy to take any ideas that the community has. If you liked the video, make sure to drop a like. If you didn't, let me know why. If you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future videos. A lot more coming on the Walstad method and a lot more coming on saltwater tanks too if you're interested in any of that. But with that, have a great night and stay curious.